Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel. My name is Melody Gracia, NXUnite team member at Nexus Marketing, and your moderator for today's panel. Today's panel topic is Invested Donors, Cultivating Positive Relationships. And as usual, before I introduce today's panelists and we jump into this fascinating topic, I do have some quick logistics to cover. NXUnite by Nexus Marketing serves as a powerful community resource designed to foster connections and facilitate lasting relationships within the mission-driven sector. On NXUnite, you can find upcoming industry events, suggested influencers to follow, trusted solutions, and cost-driven podcasts. NXUnite also hosts webinars, demos, and of course, panels with experts such as these lovely folks with me here today. Today's sponsor is Double the Donation. It is the leading provider of corporate employee matching gift tools. Through the use of their matching gift software, nonprofits, schools, and universities significantly boost their matching gift and volunteer grant revenue. Thank you so much for supporting the NXUnite mission. All right, today's hour-long panel will include time both for questions curated by my team and questions from you all, our fantastic audience. So at any time during the panel, please feel free to submit your questions via the chat, and we'll spend the second half of the panel addressing as many as we possibly can. Now, if you're having any technical difficulties or have any logistics questions, my team member Anton is in the chat under the Team NXUnite username, ready to assist you the best he can. I also wanted to share that this panel is being recorded. So for those of you watching live, the recording will be sent to you via DM in the NXUnite Community Platform within the hour after we wrap up. And people can continue to access the recording after the panel in the event recording library. Finally, before I introduce today's panelists, I want to thank you all for attending this panel. Whether you're attending live or watching the recording, we're very excited to be in touch with you, the mission-driven community. So thank you for taking the time to be with us today to learn from these outstanding experts who I will now finally introduce. I'd like to first introduce Jay Finney, who is the Vice President of Donor Engagement and Nonprofit Strategies at Story Cause. For more than 20 years, he has partnered with a wide variety of nonprofit organizations, helping them formulate cohesive development and communication strategies. This has included everything from donor acquisition to major gift and planning giving programs. Jay, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, great to be here.
Also with us today is Karen Houghton, who is the CEO of Infinite Giving and a nonprofit investment advisor. She leverages her deep nonprofit expertise to bring modern cash management to nonprofit organizations all over the U.S. She advocates for organizational sustainability through better financial management, strategic access to curated investment practices, increased stock, crypto, and DAF giving. Karen, thanks for being here.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Also with us is Mackenzie Burke-Buckler, who is a partnership success specialist at Double the Donation, the leading provider of matching gift automation software. Through her role, Mackenzie works with fundraising technology companies to help nonprofits and educational institutions leverage the power of corporate matching gifts. Mackenzie, so glad you could join.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And finally with us is Susan Can, who is the founder and principal of Sapphire Fundraising Specialists. She has more than a decade of working in the nonprofit sector and has experience working with planned giving, capital campaigns, major gifts, mid-level donors, and creating and executing fundraising strategies and events. Susan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. Good to be here.
All right, now it's finally time to hear from our panelists. And Jay, I'll have you start us off with our first question. What are some key principles or strategies that nonprofits should consider when engaging with donors or supporters to ensure long-term loyalty and support?
So I think it's important to remember that, I think all of us, if we're on this call or we do this for a living, we give to a lot of different charities. I think you're either philanthropic or you're not. And how can you stand out? So I think about the nonprofits I give to at the end of the year, which is the time when most people are doing it. And what's the experience afterwards? Who do I remember fondly that I gave to? And in the end, everybody sort of feels like it's doing the same thing. So, how can you stand out from the crowd, and how can you, sort of, when somebody makes a $25 gift as a first time donor, how can you help them feel like, oh wow, this makes a difference, or they know that I made a gift. And I think a lot of organizations, nonprofits, struggle with that. I just don't get a feeling of who's doing something different. And occasionally we'll see something, but by and large, it's mostly, you're getting a thank you email, and then we start getting solicitations through direct mail and digital, and everybody's doing that. So, I think one of the things we try and come up with are how are ways to maybe stand out from the crowd a little bit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for starting us off. Karen, what should nonprofits do to keep donors loyal and supportive over time?
Yeah, Jay made some great points, because as soon as you asked that, like, I went back to a couple of things where I'm like, oh, I like how that organization did that. And it is about like what you remember. I mean, ultimately, if you're watching this webinar, this is your space, this. And I think the trap that so many of us can fall into is the idea that we just need things from our donors, right? And so we're asking and we're asking and we're asking. And then sometimes the worst thing you can do is not be in communication with them until you make the next ask, right? And so nobody wants to just constantly felt like they are being asked for money, even though that's the fundraiser's job, right? That's what development folks do. So it's a really amazing art form when you can prioritize the relationship and think of it not just as a donor who can give, but hey, this is a relationship. How can I think about it in a respectful, like, back and forth way, like where you're ultimately inviting them into a story. And then you have these touch points of storytelling without always having to make an over ask. And I think a lot of that is from the gratitude, right? But then to Jay's point, it's like, okay, so then we all do thank you notes, but then if they're all the same, or it's the automated email thank you, is that enough? And I think that's where the more you can think about special or unique ways, which I know can be hard and I know it's tiring, but it's like, hey, that's a person and that's a relationship that you want to build. So with your friends, you're not just reaching out, or a neighbor when you need a favor. You're also like saying, hey, let's go to coffee, or let's do this, and maybe not asking something from them. And finding that balance, I think, is the key to building really longevity in those relationships and true donor engagement, especially for those bigger gifts.
Thanks, Karen. All right, Mackenzie, what strategies do you recommend to keep donors loyal?
Yeah, and I definitely agree with everything that Jay and Karen said so far. I think obviously, in whatever ways possible, you want to kind of maintain that giving momentum after the donation. I think we know that donors are most connected to your organization at that point of donation, right? While they're going through giving and thinking about the impact that they can have. And so I think you really want to maintain that feeling as much as possible. And so I know a lot of times we think about these like long-term strategies, but to have that long-term strategy, to have that long-term support, I think it's really important to provide really immediate kind of ways for your supporter to hear from you and to also, continue being involved with you that don't just involve that kind of financial transactional piece, right? You want them to have these really immediate touch points. And so I think sending those communications about the impact that their gift is having, sending them stories, to Karen's point, sending them ways to get involved, whether that's through volunteering, whether that's through something like what we do through a matching gift program, whether that's through just connecting with you on Facebook, and then you can interact with them there. I think finding these really immediate ways that they can feel like, oh, hey, this organization, my gift is driving an impact, and this organization wants to stay in touch with me. They don't just want me to kind of be that piggy bank, kind of to Karen's point before. I think that that's really impactful. And the closer you can do that to the point of donation, the closer you can make that feeling that the donor has, that connection that they have, the more you can make that linger, I think, ultimately the better and the longer lasting that this relationship will end up being.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mackenzie. All right, Susan, final thoughts on how to keep donors loyal.
Well, I totally am in agreement with what has been said already. One last thing I would say is that to think about the word should. Oftentimes at nonprofits, we hear, oh, this person should be giving this much, or this person should be doubling their gift, or this person should definitely be giving a gift this year. And at the end of the day, donating is voluntary and no one has to do it. And so just remember that when you're showing your donors gratitude, be really authentic with it, because the first gift is wonderful and amazing, but we also want them to continue a relationship with us and build and continue to give to us. And that only happens if they feel like my gift matters and not because they feel obligated. And so you want to make sure that you're demonstrating that throughout the journey you have with that donor.
Thanks, Susan. All right, we're off to a great start. And Mackenzie, I'll have you start us off with the next question. In what ways can technology be leveraged to enhance donor engagement and communication, and regardless of the specific focus of the organization?
Yeah, I think we know that obviously increasingly donors do really expect hyper personalized communications. I think they know that you kind of have data on them, that you have the ability to craft these targeted messages based on their characteristics and their attributes. And so I think whenever something just feels kind of mass generated or like kind of a broadcast that's not going to be as effective, I think donor engagement is really only possible when that personalization is in place. So I think using technology to enable that personalization is really important, whether that means, if you know that this donor gave to a specific cause of yours, so they're interested in that part of your mission and programming, and then you're sending them updates about that mission, that part of your programming, right? Or you're sending them messages that'll help them understand how they can, help advance that specific program and get involved. That's really important. Sending them maybe exclusive invitations to events that appeal to their interests. All of those things I think are really important. And I think, using that personalization and segmentation is going to be really important to helping this donor grow their connection to your cause over time. And so use technology to make that really possible for your team and do this efficiently. I know that it can seem scary to think about, hey, I need to personalize every communication. But, you can use technology to analyze that data and to put into place these processes.
Thanks, Mackenzie. All right, Susan, how can tech enhance donor engagement and communication?
Sure. Well, this isn't necessarily a new part of technology, but I think we don't look enough at email open rates and click rates, and how we're getting that data has changed as Google and Apple and Yahoo have changed some of how they allow some of that data to go through. But just taking a review of what emails had a higher open rate than other emails, what emails had a higher click rate, where did people click, and just having an understanding of who also is doing that, I think can really help us to better communicate and see what are people most interested in. And the other thing I would just add is that I'm hoping most people on this call all have some type of CRM, some type of database for their donors, and making sure that you put information into that CRM, because your data is only as good as the data that is entered. So making sure that you are tracking information so that you can access it later.
Thanks, Susan. All right, Jay, thoughts on how tech can enhance engagement and communication?
Yeah, so, along with what Mackenzie said, being able to personalize communication is now easier than it's been. We actually, on Friday, just dropped our first test piece around this with one of our clients. We captured the stories that some of their constituents have to tell about why they're tied to the organization. And then we used AI to create appeals that are personalized around their story. Our initial sort of vision for this was you would get an appeal that was completely customized to you based on sort of the story that you told. It was a little aggressive. In the end, what we're just doing is sort of personalizing the first paragraph or two. But basically, the term in sales is show me you know me. So if you're trying to sell somebody something, you want to show them that you understand who they are, you've done your research, you know their business. The same thing in nonprofit. If the same concept, if you can reach out to a donor and say, this is what we know is most important to you. We've heard why the story that you told, why you give. That means something. I think Karen mentioned in the last question about people being able to sort of tell their story, listening to that story and then being able to feed it back to them. The technology now exists. It's not perfect, and some of the folks on our team that have been working with the AI have gotten really good at being able to read a paragraph and saying, oh, this was created by AI, just something seems off. So it's not perfect, and it's still fairly labor intensive on our end as we're doing this, because we don't want to just send something out without having a human eyes look at it. But it's coming, and so being able to customize or Mackenzie's term, and we use it as well, hyper personalize the service or the material that's being served up to the individual, just makes it that much more meaningful to them. So that exists. It's getting better. One of the things we do suggest for folks, if they're not comfortable doing this, though, is at least start to capture the stories your donors have to tell. That's in our name, Story Cause. Capture those stories so that at some point you can understand, especially if you're a large nonprofit and you have a lot of different work that you're doing, being able to say, okay, here's Susan. We know Susan cares most about this part of our mission. Let's make sure we're serving her content and asks, impact reports that match up and align with what she cares most about. That's getting a lot easier with AI now.
Thanks, Jay. All right, Karen, what would you like to add in how tech can enhance engagement and communication?
So I would love to talk about it in the kind of aspect of giving and types of giving. Because when you look at donors, right, and you think about donor engagement, ideally, we're talking about all the steps before that, but then it's like, all right, well, how do they want to give? And so many organizations are putting too many friction points in how a donor can give to them. And they don't always realize it, and that's okay. But it's like just doing a basic audit of like your website. How many clicks does it take before they can give you money? It seems silly, but it's like, hey, if I have to go and then I'm clicking and I got to scroll, and then it's called CTAs, so call to actions, right? Are you asking me to give? Are you asking me to volunteer? Are you doing this? And then how many of these do I have to scroll through and decipher before I can actually give you something? And so you always want to think about removing any potential barriers. I'd suggest never having like a donor have to create a login and a password. So I know some people still do that. Some churches do that. It is a pain point. You don't want to have to download an app. So like, how do you remove barriers for them to give? How do you make it as easy for them to find you? And then look at the types of ways you're asking them to give. And a part of this is listening, right? Sometimes I have donors who are just talking to me and they're like, well, I give these they're high capacity donors. We've done a lot of research with high capacity donors. And they're like, well, I know that this big university can take my stock gift, and I got a little bit of Bitcoin over here, and they do that. And they're like, yeah, I give these small gifts to these other organizations, but they can't take my big gifts. They don't know how to handle them. And that always breaks my heart a little bit, because sometimes those organizations are the one who need those funds the most. But then when you talk to the nonprofit leadership or the development folks, they're like, I never get asked about those. No one's really asked me. So sometimes it's a chicken and an egg problem. Sometimes it's just letting your donors know, like, actually, we may be a smaller organization, but we're more sophisticated than you might think. And finding the technology partner who can come alongside and say, actually, yes, we can make it easy for you to receive stocks, crypto, donor advised fund grants, endowments, legacy giving, matching corporate, right, with double the donation. So you have all of these partners out here who can help get those asset gifts. So like the biggest way to leave you with this idea is that the average cash gift online is $128. The average stock gift in the US is $8,000. So you can have 62 cash donors on your website, and then you're building relationships with 62 different people to get the equivalent of one stock donation that's $8,000. So it's a lot of work. The correct answer is you have to build relationships with all of them. I wish it was easier to be like, great, I just want that one. That's easier. But the reality is, if you're not opening yourself up and giving yourself the infrastructure to receive the bigger gifts, donors know that. and they still want those tax savings. So they're going to have to go another route to another organization to get the tax savings they want. And you've missed out and you don't always know. So remove barriers and increase the ways that they can give you, especially those high capacity donors, because there's so many tax efficiencies and they know those, and the education around that is growing. And my wish is that everyone has that accessible so that those high capacity gifts can go to the smaller orgs in addition to the bigger ones.
Thanks, Karen. All right, very quickly, I'd like to remind our live audience to start submitting your questions at any time, and we'll get to them during the second half of the panel. All right, here's our next question. And Susan, I'll have you start us off with this one. How important is transparency and accountability in fostering trust and strengthening relationships with stakeholders? And how can nonprofits demonstrate these values effectively?
Well, I think it is essential. And I think that we are also getting to a point where it is more and more important. If you think about generations, I think about my grandparents' generation, who I would call the silent generation. They would give, if someone sent them a direct mail piece asking for money, they'd write a check. Here, have some money. Maybe not a big gift, but they'd give to a lot of different organizations. They maybe didn't know much about it, but if someone reached out to them, they would give some money. Then I think about my parents' generation, who are baby boomers, and they are, have a few causes they care a lot about, and they give to those, and they know a lot about them. And then I think about my generation. I'm a millennial, and we are much more want to know more information before we make a gift, much less confident that the nonprofit knows what they're doing. We want to know more first. And then you think about Gen Z, which is coming up, and they are much less loyal to organizations and much more loyal to causes. And so again, as we are, ages change and people get older and money changes hands, it's really important that we're showing some transparency and that we're showing evidence. And what does evidence mean when it comes to donors? It means pictures of the work, videos of the work, testimonials, bring people in so that they see, here's what your money's actually doing. And I think that is just so, so important. We can't just tell them, but we have to show them.
Thanks, Susan. All right, Mackenzie, thoughts on the importance of transparency and accountability?
Yeah, I 100% agree with Susan. I think especially as millennial and Gen Z donors just become more important. I think that obviously being transparent and accountable is just going to continue to grow as kind of like this cornerstone of your strategy. I think about this too, like before we were talking about hyper-personalization, I think part of that is because of millennial and Gen Z donors, right? They learn, I think, as you think about it, like in the for-profit world, they're kind of used to demanding that transparency and accountability too. They're used to having hyper-personalized communications, things like that. And so I think a lot of that ends up translating into donor behavior as well. And so I think that it's really important to show how you're allocating funds, how you're making an impact, to Susan's point, and really provide that proof and show how you're kind of expanding impact over time. And so I think it's really all about, and this is going to sound pretty simple, but proactive communication and providing these really consistent updates to donors. So don't make them ask, be really proactive about it. I know it can be difficult to talk about, even challenges that you face or maybe like blockers in kind of progress. But I think that it's important to be honest about those challenges increasingly now too. And I think that'll be powerful for donors to hear because it shows them that you're being open. And if you can also articulate like a plan and a vision for how to overcome that challenge, I think that they're going to buy into that and they're really going to want to help you, and that's going to get their support. So I think, being open to talking about any of those challenges and articulating that path forward and how to navigate that is really important. And then the other thing that I would mention is just to show transparency and accountability, also being really proactive in involving donors and stakeholders in any decision making is powerful as well. So kind of seek that regular feedback from them, and then use those insights, whether it's from a survey or a focus group or something like that, to actually inform your future strategies and to move your organization forward. I think obviously whenever donors feel like they're heard, they have kind of a say in the directions and the decision-making process, that's going to engage them in the long term. There's kind of like more at stake for them. They really buy in and they feel like their identity is in some ways tied to your organization as well.
Thanks, Mackenzie. All right, Karen, over to you. How important is transparency and accountability?
I'm on the finance side, so it's very, very important. There is a lot of responsibility and weight and burden, and it's a gift too. But when you're handling donor dollars, there is just this whole added layer to stewardship and how you're sharing that with others. My tip is going to be a little bit different in that I think a lot of folks do understand, like, hey, we need to, put our reports up and like download, our balance sheets and 1099. Like, there's all of these things that we can make public, and we should. And I think that's a good idea. And even just having it on your website, I don't know how many people actually are going to review it, but it's there in case somebody wants to. And I think that that's an incredibly valuable, transparent kind of action. The other interesting side is internally, how much do you know? Like when you're stewarding, and these are internal conversations, right? So it's like we're talking about donors, and I get that, but there is also that other side where sometimes, I'm talking to boards, I'm like, great, do you know what fees you're paying XYZ? And they're like, no. Or they're talking to a finance and they're like, actually, we just found this other old brokerage account that no one had checked for weeks or years, right? So there's all these different things that I think we have to get the inside of our house clean first, and to make sure that we're asking those questions of like, hey, do we have transparency on fees? Do we understand you need to pay for stuff, right? Like we can't be fearful of that. To do and move your mission forward, you have to pay for things. But being able to understand like, hey, yes, we chose to make this spend and here's why, or yes, we actually do understand the fees here, or our reserves are sitting in a bank account that's making 0.1%. And I'm like, great, you could be in treasuries making 5.5%, and they're leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table with low risk, high liquidity options. I know I'm getting my investor hat on, but it is one of those things that people hear investment and they get scared. And I'm like, no, like even just in a money market, are your funds FDIC covered? All of that, I think, is a piece of what falls under transparency and accountability. So that's a soapbox that I keep going on, but I won't. But I will say one other thing is that if you're not sure how you're rating on this, ask people. There's a great opportunity that is a little scary, but you can ask people for feedback, right? Whether it's maybe a donor who gave once and never gave again, or you have donors who give regularly. And I would just say, hey, do you feel like you're making an impact? Like, how much communication would you prefer? And I think asking for open feedback allows you to also identify some areas that you may miss when you're so deep into your own work.
Wonderful. Thanks, Karen. All right, Jay, final thoughts on the importance of transparency and accountability.
Yeah. So Susan, I thought that was a great analysis of sort of, generationally how people are looking at this. And that was what I was thinking about. When I talk to my mom sometimes, and she'll say, oh, she'll give to a new charity, and she goes on Charity Navigator and looks them up. And then one of the things that she gets stuck on is how much sometimes the head of the nonprofit gets paid. And she's like, well, I don't want to pay or make a donation because the CEO gets $750,000 and that's too much. And so I'll say, okay, well, when you're going to invest in a company, do you want a company that pays their CEO, $60,000, or do you want one that's paying millions of dollars? And, that's a little inside baseball, but I think a lot of people, everybody has the tools now to do this research if they want to, but a lot of times doing it actually makes it worse. They don't understand some of maybe the nuance to it, but I do feel like, and I think Mackenzie said this, you have to really communicate this constantly. I've seen some of our clients that do a really nice job with impact reports, with actual stories of people they've helped. We've got one that we've worked with that shows this is the person that made the gift, and here's somebody that it actually helped. And it was part of a scholarship, so it was easy to match them up. They interviewed both the donor and the recipient, so it told a nice sort of story arc of from beginning to end. So I think you just have to look for ways to sort of tell that story. You do have to also be aware, people paint nonprofits with a very broad brush. So bad news in any nonprofit sort of unfortunately affects everybody. And certainly if you're within a sector, that doesn't help. The other thing that I don't have an answer to this, but I've been hearing more and more of our clients talk about is that they'll say donors are starting to say we're woke. And that means something different to everybody, but it is something that, you just have to sort of, people now come at it with different lenses, and I don't know that there's a right way or a wrong way to combat this, but you just have to make sure your message is out there, that you're true to who you've been, or that when people started giving, and whether that's just through storytelling, through your year-end reports, and being really upfront about what you spent. It's a challenge, though. I think now that people have all this sort of information at their fingertips, you kind of have to sort of be everywhere all at once, which is a tough thing to do.
I think, Jay, that's you're touching on a really great point, because I think sometimes I would love to add, like, you have to give yourself permission to fire a donor, which seems like, wait, no, we need every dollar, and the mission's so important. And I agree. Like in business, they call it your ICP, right? It's your ideal customer profile. So for this landscape, it's the IDP, right? Your ideal donor profile. So looking at, like, if your organization is moving or is different than what a donor who has been with you for a long time, right? Of course, you do the high relationship touch. You try to explain, you try to meet them where they are. But I do think sometimes, especially if your organization is shifting or there become generational gaps, there's a lot of different things in there. You do everything you can to make it right. But then ultimately, if you're like, hey, this is not who we're targeting anymore, and now we're here and they're over there, it's okay. They're ideally, right, you're going to have new folks come on. So it's more about making your mission and what you're trying to do very, very clear. So you're attracting the right donors who want to support you, and that will make your life a lot easier.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jay and Karen. All right, Karen, I'm actually going to stick with you for our next question. What role does effective communication play in nurturing relationships with donors and supporters? And how can nonprofits ensure messaging aligns with their mission and values?
I mean, communication breathes into everything, right? It's like the relationship building, it's your marketing, it's your storytelling. And we've talked a lot about stories, right? It's like, are you using the images? Are you letting them know about the impact? Are you measuring the impact? Are you communicating with them in ways before you're asking them for funds, right? And so I think that consistency is clear, making sure that you're not just waiting to reach out to them when you have an ask, but you're actually building that relational equity with them. And making sure that it's really clear, because that's transparency, right? Whether it's about your mission, like you need to be really clear on, like, hey, this is the work that we're doing and here's why. And if it's changed, that's okay, right? Everyone makes pivots, right? And ideally there's some folks who are like, well, we solved that problem, so now we're doing this, and it's unclear. I'm like, what an amazing problem to have. Excuse me, that you've been so successful that now you're called into this area of work. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in there. I think the big thing to recognize is that communication is hard work. And people like to communicate in different ways. And so again, that's where that relationship comes in. And, or if you're doing marketing or you're doing different opportunities, changing kind of how you're speaking about different things, to Susan's point, will allow you to kind of beta test and be like, all right, when we stated the same thing, I'm not saying like have different missions, but if you stated a little differently, did you get a bigger open rate? Were people more engaged, or did it drop? And then follow those breadcrumbs to be like, okay, the majority of our audience is here, but we've noticed this one donor who gives every year has been a little less engaged. So maybe we have a different touch there. But it's just about people, and people are hard. But the more you can communicate and be transparent, I think that's like a superpower, that if you can do that, it makes other things fall into place.
Thanks, Karen. All right, Jay, thoughts on the role of effective communication and how to align messaging with mission and values?
Yeah, so like Karen said, it's everything. I think most people assume if they're a lower level donor, if they're just starting giving to an organization, they're going to get mass communication. You're going to get a newsletter, you're going to get a calendar year-end appeal, a fiscal year-end appeal, all of those things. You're not expecting, to get sort of anything that's clearly handwritten or a phone call from a board member. But starting to be able to break apart your donor base. We call it internally, and with our clients, we call them donors and settlers. We call them pioneers and settlers. The pioneers are people who are going to make gifts and are going to continue to make gifts and could grow. And those are going to be people that, somewhere down the line, those are going to be your major gift prospects, your planned giving folks. Your settlers are your people who are going to start giving and hopefully will continue to give, but are never going to do more than $100 a year. They're going to settle at some place, and that's where they're going to stay. And that's great. You want to keep those folks giving. That's an important, that's sort of your base. But as you think about your resources and where you want to spend them, where can you, those pioneers are folks where you can affect change. So, yeah, you're going to do your mass market communication, and that's important, and that has to go out. But are there people who, through their actions, through how they react to different appeals, that you'll say, okay, this person actually we might be able to affect some change with? And some of this is, we encourage, and we've talked a little bit about this, encourage our clients to not have an ask for everything. Sometimes if you're a local charity and it sets up, can you ask people, would they like a tour? And a lot of people will say yes, but how many of those folks will actually go through the tour? And some of it is just, the calculus they're doing in their mind. I'm going to have to take half a day off, drive downtown, find a place to park. I'm going to take a half a day and do that. If I'm going to do that, that says something about how much I care about the organization. There's an easy way to do it too. If you ask people to call in, and say, this is not a solicitation. Your message helps shape our mission. Take a minute and call us, and just sort of to find out who does call, and have a couple of questions. This ties into it. One of the questions we encourage our clients to ask is, do you feel like we are reporting impact to you effectively? And so that gets back to the last question. Are people, are you communicating to them in such a way that they know what their gift is doing? But as it relates to this question, if somebody takes 20 minutes to call in, that tells you how they feel about the organization, and flagging those donors, because those are the folks I think that you're going to be able to continue to move up. And so, everybody's short-staffed. Are there ways you can start to look at your donor base and break it into smaller parts and say, okay, this is the group that we know we can move up. These folks, we just need to make sure they continue to give. Makes it maybe a little more easy to sort of digest the overall donor database that you've got. Just looking at strategies like that.
Thanks, Jay. All right, Susan, any tips on how to align messaging with mission and values?
Sure. So I feel like what Jay was saying is absolutely right, that if someone's giving you their time, you need to listen to that. That is a flag that donor is really interested. But just to add on to that is that donors want to be generous when they can. If they care about a cause, they want to be helpful. But you have to then tell them, what does that actually mean? So you may think, oh, it's obvious we need money. We're a nonprofit. But I was just talking to one of my clients, and they were meeting with someone, and they've met with them multiple times. And she's like, I don't understand. This person hasn't given money yet. And I'm like, have you asked her to make a donation? And she's like, well, no. But again, she knows we need money. And I'm like, but you haven't asked her. So I think this is one of those cases where you may think you're being really obvious, but unless you are explicitly saying, will you donate X number of dollars to our nonprofit, that you haven't asked. And the other thing with that is that make sure that you're talking about your mission as why someone should give. Because oftentimes I'll hear, oh, we need more money. We have such big budget needs. We need more staff. But that isn't as exciting to a donor. And going back again to what Jay was saying about, looking at the salaries of CEOs, what does that, forget about how much money that is, but what does that CEO bring to the table? Maybe some experience, maybe relationships, maybe a knowledge of how to carry an organization through something. So it's less about the salaries, but what are the salaries allowing the people to do with the cause? So keep talking again and again and clearly communicate. This is what we do. This is why we do it. This is who we help. And will you donate this much money to help us do more? And I think that those tips could be really helpful.
Thanks, Susan. All right, Mackenzie, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that really has been said so far. I think one thing that I always like to talk about is just the importance of being donor-centric in your communication. So I think, a lot of times this is really just about reframing some of your messaging from we achieved this as an organization to the generous support of our donors did this for our beneficiaries. And so I think it's a very simple reframing technique, but I think if you can show donors that it's their support that's pushing your mission forward. It's their volunteerism, their advocacy, whatever that is, that's moving the needle. That's going to make it so that they understand that your mission wouldn't be possible without them. And so then they're going to be really eager to get involved. And that's going to be a really effective communication that's more likely to resonate with them. And they're more likely to remember 5 days down the road, 5 years down the road, rather than just, our organization is doing great things. So I think being able to show donors and any supporter really how their action is making a difference is important. And then I think the other thing too that sometimes can just get lost in the shuffle a little bit is just like making sure that your entire team really has an understanding of messaging guidelines too, and kind of how to incorporate your mission into those communications. I think that team-wide knowledge and cultivating that team-wide knowledge of your messaging, your tone, your language is really important, because then every communication, no matter if it's a donation appeal, something like a matching gift communication like my company does, or like volunteer appeals, every single thing, or even like a story that you're telling about a donor, there will be this cohesive thread in your messaging. Even though the ask or the intent of that message is very different, you can have that really cohesive understanding.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mackenzie. All right, Susan, I'll have you start us off the next question. How can nonprofits adapt their engagement strategies to meet the evolving needs and preferences of donors and supporters in today's digital age?
Yeah, well, I think we've talked about this a little bit already, but I think segmentation is really important, and it's easier than ever with a lot of the technology tools that we have. So something like if someone gave by credit card online, you can talk to them a certain way versus someone who gave by check versus someone who gave through a donor advised fund. You can talk to people differently based on their giving. The way they gave. Same thing, I talk a lot about generations. People, someone who's, let's say, in their 80s, maybe pick up the phone for them versus someone in their 30s, text them. So I think thinking about, and this is obviously more of a major gift strategy and a one-on-one, but think about what is going to resonate with that type of person and follow their lead in terms of communication. But I would say the same things, again, Jay has been talking about, Karen's been talking about it. Stories are still really, really important when it comes to engagement. Stories are much more memorable than statistics and can be repeated. And I think, just as we're thinking about how to engage donors who, beyond just giving, asking them to enlarge our network, stories are much easier for them to remember and tell the next person and then the next person. So those are some of the things I would remind you all about how to engage your donors.
Thanks, Susan. All right, Mackenzie, any advice on how to adapt engagement strategies to meet evolving needs of donors?
Yeah, I think obviously, to your point before, Susan, just hyper-personalized, hyper-specific, segmented communications really just are no longer really a nice to have. It is kind of this need to have if you want your donors to be engaged. And so whatever communication you're sending, whatever engagement opportunity you're asking a supporter to take part in, I think it's really important that you take into account their unique preferences and characteristics really at a baseline. Beyond just that, though, I think as we think digital, it's also increasingly important to think about kind of the role of two-way communication online. And so I think it's no longer about, talking at your donors online. It's about talking with them, getting their input, responding to their thoughts, really making them feel like their voice is heard, that their kind of opinions, ideas are helping push that mission forward. And so being interactive with donors and engaging with them online, I think can be really powerful. Encourage them to share their experience, react to that, really make sure that you're actively listening. Again, I think we know that for-profit brands are increasingly doing this online, and I think you can learn a lot from those strategies about how to interact with your supporter base and really get them to be responsive. And then, of course, I think as you do that, I think what you'll see is that you can also build this nonprofit community online where donors engage with you, they engage with each other, and they really kind of see that connection to your organization as helping them kind of unlock some social benefits and connections for them. They can really show their values. And I think that that's going to create a really strong engagement strategy that will be sustained in the digital world, and your donors will want to keep interacting with you online.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Jay, over to you. How can nonprofits meet evolving needs of donors?
So I One of the things I think that if I think back 15 years ago, it used to be really easy for a nonprofit to say, okay, well, we spent X on direct mail and we raised Y. We spent X on the telephone and we raised Y. And you could just sort of say, okay, what is our ROI on each of these? And I think now they all work together. I know just myself, I mean, when I get a direct mail piece, I'm not going to, find a checkbook and write a check, but it might cause me to go to the website or an email or something like that. And so, it's hard now to be able to say, okay, what's our actual return on investment on a direct mail drop, because it is affecting you in other places. So that's not great news necessarily, because I think we do talk to clients and to nonprofits who, in a certain cash situation, will say we're going to have to cut back. So let's cut back on the our direct mail, and it's certainly it's going to affect the handful of people who give by direct mail, but I think you're going to see that across the other channels. I know a lot of colleges, for example, stopped doing student calling during COVID, and then many didn't start back up. And we've talked to schools that said, there's one school in North Carolina that had 9% of their donors that were phone responsive, and they've lost those donors because they don't respond to any other outreach. And that speaks to something Susan said with, if somebody gives over the phone and you're using the phone, obviously in that case, then that's how you should ask them. If they give through direct mail and they write a check, well, then you need to still do it that way. You need to sort of meet the donor where they are, and we've said it's you don't want to make it harder. And if parents of this, you don't want to make it harder for people to make a gift. So I think you've got to just be sort of mindful that, okay, the technology has changed, and just because I don't respond to direct mail or pick up the phone or anything like that doesn't mean other folks don't. The other thing that I think about is, every nonprofit that I've ever met with at some point has said, we need to get younger donors. And if anybody could figure out how to get younger donors, you could retire rich. The reality is younger people just, they'll give it smaller amounts. They don't tend to stick. You've got to take that. It'd be great to get younger, but you have to keep in mind sort of where your donors are. And they're going to be older for most organizations. There are some where that's not the case, but you kind of have to meet them wherever they are. And that probably means you're going to have to continue to be sort of multi-channel, even if that doesn't necessarily seem particularly cost effective.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jay. All right, Karen, final thoughts on how to meet the evolving needs and preferences of donors.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because there's almost a little bit of like the pendulum swinging to more analog. It's like we have more technology, but then also, especially I think after the pandemic, we're like, actually, we want to see people. And, when people are working from home more and more, it's like a little easier to get them out sometimes for events. And so I like the idea of thinking about like, how do you bring more digital engagement and kind of leverage some of these opportunities in analog environments? And so things like galas or mailers or things that you're doing, how do you then convert that to a digital experience, right? And so I think there's opportunities like, for instance, and slightly shameless plug, but just as an example, like for Infinite Giving, we've got a donation page that does it's a full stack. So like stocks, crypto, DAFs, endowments, legacy giving, cash, all of that. Great. Guess what though? It's mobile friendly and you can turn that into a QR code. And so now it's like you have one place where by just figuring out what technology, and there's a lot of different options out there, but all the time we have people be like, oh my gosh, we did a mailer, but we put the QR code on there that went to a mobile friendly donation page. And then all of their giving was up. So a donor all of a sudden could scan it and look at their phone and be like, oh, I could give a stock gift in 2 minutes, just like this, done. So I think there's ways that you can kind of leverage tech in events and things like that didn't exist 5 years ago, right? And then you're like, okay, I can bring a really modern experience that's going to remove barriers and help meet donors where they are in a really convenient way while still kind of building that relationship.
Thanks, Karen. All right, we're officially opening our Q&A portion. We got 2 questions here, one from Brandon. And Karen, I'll stick with you for this question. What is the best route for a burgeoning nonprofit that needs the funding to even apply for 501c3 status? We are within the IRS grace period and currently tax exempt by default as a church.
Hey, Brandon, I would say you shouldn't need funding for a 501c3. So at the lowest kind of hanging, I would say you don't need it. You don't need funding. So 501c3 status, you should have maybe there's some small filing. You don't have to hire a big fancy attorney to do your 501c3. In a previous life, before I did Infinite Giving, I was also a founder of a nonprofit. We did a lot of work. So I've done all of that as an executive director, and I DIY'd it. And I had to Google a lot, right? And I had to figure some things out, but you can file those forms, you can create the LLC, you can do the 501c3 tax exempt status. So it takes a little bit of work, but it should not be very expensive. If that is overwhelming to you, congratulations, you're human. But there are also a lot of attorneys who will do work pro bono, meaning they will do something for free. So this is a very basic filing. They can't do it without you. They're going to need a ton of information from you still, like, hey, what's your mission? What kind of work are you doing? Who's on your board? Things like that, which again, you can Google and kind of work through that. But if you have all of that with them, then you can ask an attorney to file some of those for you on a pro bono status. And it should be a lot more straightforward for you.
Thanks, Karen. Anyone else want to add to that? Otherwise, we'll move on to Jeff's question. All right, here's Jeff's question. And Jay, I'll have you start us off with this one. Any suggestions for how to engage individual donors who are giving annually without being asked, but who have not been asked to give more? What steps would you take?
Well, first of all, that's a great problem to have if you've got people that are giving without being asked. That's congratulations. One of the things that either we do with our clients or we encourage them to do is to sort of reach out and we say capture the story that your donor has to tell. Why did they start giving? What's most important to you? So maybe it's calling a group of these folks and just saying, hey, thanks for your giving. Why did you start giving? What's most important to you? Where do you want to see your philanthropy helping? And then, you can start to communicate around what they say, starting to, either on the macro level. So, okay, this is what our donors care most about, or even on the individual level, certainly for high net worth donors, that may make sense. But the ability to capture the story that your donor has to tell, and then being able to take your message and serve it back up to them in such a way that fits with what they care about, that's just going to make them feel that much more sort of in alignment with your mission. What I would say then is, I would assume you must be asking them on some level, but maybe if you're changing up how you're asking them, what you're asking them for based on what they tell you, I think that you're going to see that giving is going to go up. I'm assuming maybe they're just giving at the same level, but there are some ways to say, hey, this is what you care most about. We heard you tell us that. We appreciate your $500 gift. Here's what $1,000 is going to help us do that stays in alignment with what you care about. So if you can start to gather some of that information on those donors, I think that'll help you customize the appeal and the outreach that you're going to do following up with that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jay. All right. Unbelievably, the hour has gone by so quickly, so we're going to wrap up this portion of the panel so we can stick to our schedule. Now, if you have more questions for our panelists, please complete the survey that will be dropped in the chat to indicate which panelists you have questions for, and we'll make sure to connect you with them after the session. I've had such a wonderful time hearing from our panelists today, and I'm hoping to get one final piece of insight from them all in this speed round. And Mackenzie, I'll have you start us off with a question. What do you see as the future of nonprofit supporter engagement, and how can nonprofits get ahead today?
Yeah, I think we talked a lot today about really being personalized and kind of interactive. And so I think it's obviously going to be about embracing technology. So leverage the tools that are out there, like automation tools, to really personalize your interactions and really do this efficiently. And I think that will be helpful. And then I think the other thing that I definitely want to mention is that, I think there are also unique opportunities to engage supporters through their employers as well. I think that as corporate giving is on the rise, we're seeing a lot of companies want to get their employees involved in philanthropy. And so if you can find ways to connect with donors through those giving programs, connect them to their giving program, I think that's also going to be a huge opportunity for growth, because then the donor kind of has this dual motivation to be involved, to connect through their employer and to connect to your organization. So I think those are both kind of great opportunities available to you.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Karen, what do you see as the future of supporter engagement and how to get ahead today?
I think with more and more innovation that we're going to see more collaborative partnerships between nonprofits and tech companies, because that's going to be driving that innovation in supporter engagement. And instead of looking at it as like, hey, this is, we're moving in opposite ways, I think if it's like, hey, this is a partnership and we're helping each other, I think that that's a really strategic way to think about kind of new technologies that are popping up. But ultimately, I think we need to remember to stay agile and adaptable and really listen to those donors. And if we're listening to them in a relationship kind of capacity, then they will have the ability to inform us how they want to give and how they want to be engaged with.
Thanks, Karen. Jay, over to you. Thoughts on the future of supporter engagement and how to get ahead?
Yeah, so in the short term, one of the things that amazes me is as Americans get older, more and more people, are updating their will, doing things like that. If you're not asking, if you're in their estate plan, you're just leaving so much money on the table. And I think it's criminal, the number of organizations that I give to that have not asked me if I'm interested in doing this. They're leaving money on the table. I think, though, sort of what Mackenzie said and what everybody's talked about is personalization at scale. So capture the stories your donors have to tell, understand why they give, what they care most about, because the technology is here to some extent and only going to get better for being able to then serve up customized appeals that match exactly with what they care about. So I would say those two things.
Thanks, Jay. All right, Susan, thoughts on the future and how to get ahead today?
Well, I could not agree more with Jay about plain giving. If you are not asking your donors, will you consider leaving our organization in your will or your estate plans? You are missing out on so much money. We are in the midst of the great wealth transfer where literally like $70 trillion is being transferred between generations. So you need to be involved in this. Absolutely. And then the second thing that I would just say is that, we've talked a lot about how to get people to give more and build relationships. And I think how can we make it easier to, again, share your message with more people? Yes, there's social media, but how easy is it for someone to share your message? Well, make sure you just make it easy to connect with your donors in social media. Where are they? Have information that's easily accessible for them to share. If it's talking points, if it's stories, whatever it is, just make it easy for your donor to talk about how great your organization is so that they can help you to find more people that want to connect with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Susan. All right. And with that, we have reached the end of our panel. And I want to give a big thank you to our panelists for sharing their insights today. I also want to give a big thank you to our audience. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope you enjoyed yourself and learned something that will benefit the work that you do on a daily basis. Finally, I also would like to thank our sponsor for today's panel, Double the Donation. Thank you for your support on this free educational content. All right, that is it for me. It has been a pleasure speaking with you all. Thank you once again and have a nice rest of the day, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.